If you like Academic Agent's content on this channel, sign up for a course on the Academic Agency. He's now offering Foundations of Economics. Click the link in the show description and level up your econ knowledge.
In this video, I'm going to be considering Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. Now, I should say that those of you who saw my much older video, Ultimate Red Pill Books, will note that I recommended in that Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate, and I still stand by that recommendation. The Blank Slate is a good book. However, in this video, I'm going to be questioning the central thesis of this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is nowhere near the standard of the earlier work, The Blank Slate. Now, one of the things I want to do is to question the central premise of the book, that violence has declined. Now, to do this, I'm going to ignore the more egregious moves that Pinker makes in the book when he tries to explain away, for example, the massive death toll of the 20th century and the two world wars and the atrocities of Hitler and Stalin. I'm not going to go into that question. It has been done elsewhere and to better effect than I can manage. But make of the table that I've screen grabbed here what you will. I want to focus on two questions. First, I'm interested in Pinker's claims about medieval England being many times more violent than modern England, and also about Pinker's claims concerning colonial New England and its so-called civilizing process. Let me just quote from near the start of Pinker's book. He says, in 1981, the political scientist Ted Robert Gurr, using old court and county records, calculated 30 estimates of homicide rates at various times in English history, combined them with modern records from London, and plotted them on a graph. I've reproduced it in figure 3.1 using a logarithmic scale in which the same vertical distance separates 1 from 10 and 10 from 100 and 100 from 1000. The rate is calculated in the same way as in the preceding chapter, namely the number of killings per 100,000 people per year. The log scale is necessary because the homicide rate declines so precipitously. The graph shows that from the 13th century to the 20th, homicide in various parts of England plummeted by a factor of 10, 50, and in some cases 100. For example, from 110 homicides per 100,000 people per year in 14th century Oxford to less than 1 homicide per 100,000 in mid-20th century London. The graph stunned almost everyone who saw it, including me. As I mentioned in the preface, it was the seed that grew into this book. The discovery confounds every stereotype about the idyllic past and the degenerate present. When I surveyed perceptions of violence in an internet questionnaire, people guessed that 20th century England was about 14% more violent than 14th century England. In fact, it was 95% less violent. And here's a look at his amazing graph, reproduced from Gurr, which I'll just leave there for you to take a look at in your own time. Now, before I get into looking at this data a bit more closely, Pinker borrows his thesis from Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Process, written in 1939, which has this idea that there's been a kind of cultural evolution that has driven rates of violence down as governments have become more and more centralized, and this has been a civilizing process, according to Pinker. Now, this statistic about the homicide rate in the 1340s being around 110 per 100,000 has been repeated in many places. When you just give a quick Google of what was the homicide rate in the Middle Ages, many pages like this come up, and then they cite Pinker. I even caught BBC GCSE bite-sized history, peddling this statistic. So the first question to ask, of course, is, well, how representative is this one statistic taken from Oxford in the 1340s of the period? How typical of the era is it? Well, Michael Eisner, who is one of Pinker's key sources, gives a rate for the 1300s in general, a number around 79% below the headline number of 110 per 100,000 that Pinker cites. If you have a look at his graph here, in 1300 it's 23 per 100,000 according to Eisner, nowhere near the 110 per 100,000 that Pinker uses. It's a much smaller number. However, if we drill down even further, Randolph Roth, another one of the key sources of Pinker's, shows that the homicide rates in the 1200s, just a century before that, were well below even 23. You can have a look at these numbers here. 9.8 in Bedford in 1222, 16.8 50 years later. In Kent, they were 8.7 in 1250. And then you can see Oxford does seem to be above the general level, but it's still only 22.4, 19.7 in Oxford in the middle of the 1200s. So that 110 per 100,000 stat that is peddled around and repeated all over the internet seems like an outlier number, not actually typical of the era. And if you look, major cities at that time, like Bristol or London, had an even lower homicide rate again, 5.9 per 100,000 in Bristol, 6.4 per 100,000 in London. And this is taken from Roth, who, as far as I can make out, is one of the leading authorities on the topic of homicide through history, especially in England and North America. He seems to be the go-to guy for this, and we'll be hearing more from him as we go forward. Pinker uses him, but Pinker seems to ignore his actual ideas, as we'll see. So another question to ask, after asking, is 110 per 100,000 a fair reflection of the Middle Ages for violence, is also, is homicide even a good measure of civilization? The homicide stat itself, does it really tell us how civilized a society is, or even how violent a society is? Using Pinker's logic, Bristol in the year 1221, which had a homicide rate of 5.9, was 70% more civilized than the USA in 1990, 388% more civilized than Brazil in 2017, and many times more civilized than South Africa or Central America in either year. So, you can cherry pick both ways, is the point I'm trying to make. He has cherry picked 110 per 100,000 from all of the available statistics and highlighted that to show a straight line going down to today. And if you note, he compared Oxford to London when he did that comparison. But there's nothing stopping somebody else coming along and finding different data points from today and saying, well, hold on a second, this is many times higher than the one in Bristol. So it's not conclusive one way or the other when you start playing that game of cherry-picking stats. Another thing to point out is that if you go into, and the documentation for this is quite robust, freely available online. A lot of it is the work of Roth, who seems a very honest academic to me. You can actually see what each of these homicides were. And in the case of Bedfordshire and surrounding areas, a lot of the homicides were instances of what I would call private justice. Somebody being robbed and killing somebody in self-defense, for example. You can see that some of them were people resisting arrest. One of them was a father trying to save his daughter from attempted rape. So these are many cases where today, of course, most people just ring the police when faced with a situation like this, whereas back then there was more private justice. And this is part of Pinker's argument, the distinction between the violence being in the hands of the state versus violence being in the hands of private individuals. He sees it as better in the second scenario. But let's just pretend that in each of these cases the police turned up and arrested somebody and put them into jail. That doesn't actually show that people are any less violent today than they would have been in the 1200s. It just shows that we have a more reactive police force. But then Roth goes on to note a few other things. I think it's worth reading what he says. He says, "Note, however, that probably half of all homicide victims in medieval England would have survived today with the help of modern emergency services, surgery, wound care, antisepsis and antibiotics. So even if we assume a 73% undercount of the Erie records, the rate at which people suffered life-threatening assaults in medieval England would be comparable to the homicide rate in the United States from the late 1960s through the early 1990s, which averaged around 9 per 100,000 per year, and it would be far lower than the rate in the Russian Federation since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which rose to 35 to 40 per 100,000 persons per year." So it's interesting, isn't it? The homicide rate in England at that time was a little bit like that of the USA in the late 20th century, and also modern science would have saved half of those people who were killed. So how much is modern medicine masking the extent to which people are violent today? Well, just so happens we have very good statistics on these things. Knife crime in modern London is 176 per 100,000. It's old Sadiq Khan, of course. If only 1/8 of those knife crimes would have resulted in a death in 1300, the homicide rate today would be equal to the peak of the homicide rate in the Middle Ages, which, if you remember, was around 23 per 100,000 according to Manuel Eisner. So the point I'm trying to make here is, did we get less violent, or is it simply that medicine was better able to treat wounds that previously would have been fatal? I leave that for you to ponder, but it strikes me that there are many areas in which we can question Pinker's thesis so far, and also his methods. I mean, I got the impression all the way through the book that he was playing fast and loose, and that such games of statistical trickery can be played both ways, as I've been trying to show you throughout this video.
I think that we've reached peak wank.
Are you sick of hearing about Marx and Keynes? Do you want to know why neoclassical economics is so flawed? Have you ever wondered how to work out the marginal productivity of a burger bun? Do you want to level up your econ knowledge? Buy it now. £350. Foundations of Economics. Foundations of Economics. I'm here. Foundations of Economics. Get it now.
It's a very nice village, but it's a bit scattered. It's a bit scattered. Awfully scattered.
Next, Pinker turns his attention to New England, and he uses colonial New England and the establishment of the American government and so on as a good example of what he calls the civilizing process in action, reducing the homicide rate from over 100 per 100,000 in 1637 to less than 1 per 100,000 by the 1820s. New England had an exceptionally low homicide rate, perhaps, according to Roth, the lowest in the entire world in the 19th century. where does that 100 per 100,000 number for 1637 come from? How are we working out that in 1637 that many people were killed by homicide? And the source for it is, again, Randolph Roth, who explains the number as follows. He says, "The struggle for trade and territory was also indirectly responsible for many homicides because of its corrosive impact on public morality and social institutions. Whites and Indians, singly or in groups, imitated the behavior of tribes and nations. They took goods, seized land, killed anyone, native or colonist, who stood in their way and felt justified in doing so. Colonial authorities reported numerous robbery murders, vigilante murders, and revenge murders, which flourished where neither natives nor colonists could gain the upper hand and establish political control. Together, such homicides accounted for a third of the known murders of English colonists in the early years of colonization. The other two-thirds were political murders or other kinds of murders among people who knew one another. The lack of a common legal or law enforcement system and the refusal in most instances of rival tribes and nations to accept the legitimacy of one another's systems meant that criminals were almost certain to get away with murder, and that the friends and relatives of murder victims had little hope of obtaining justice." And that's in the book American Homicide, which has got many more facts and stats if you're interested. The fact is, though, that this 100 per 100,000 number is not exactly fair, is it? Because you're dealing with groups of people who are formally at war, or else openly competing for resources. This is pretty much a state of civil war. So I do think it's a little bit tricksy for Pinker to use this as his starting point for New England. Now, Pinker sees the sharp decline of the homicide rate in New England as evidence of his thesis. He says, "After this consolidation of state control, the curves for Old England and New England coincide uncannily. The rest of the Northeast also saw a plunge from triple-digit and high double-digit homicide rates to the single digits typical of the world's countries today." Now, before I go on, I think it's worth pointing out that elsewhere in the book, Pinker takes great pains to emphasize the cruelty of both the medieval world and of Christianity. He says, "Medieval Christendom was a culture of cruelty. Torture was meted out by national and local governments throughout the continent, and it was codified in laws that prescribed blinding, branding, amputation of hands, ears, noses, and tongues, and other forms of mutilation as punishments for minor crimes. Executions were orgies of sadism, climaxing with ordeals of prolonged killing, such as burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, pulling apart by horses, impalement through the rectum, disembowelment by winding a man's intestines around a spool, and even hanging, which was a slow wrecking and strangulation rather than a quick breaking of the neck. Sadistic tortures were also inflicted by the Christian Church during its inquisitions, witch hunts, and religious wars. Torture had been authorized by the ironically named Pope Innocent IV in 1251, and the Order of Dominican monks carried it out with relish. As the Inquisition coffee table book notes, under Pope Paul IV, 1555-59, the Inquisition was downright insatiable. Paul, a Dominican and one-time Grand Inquisitor, was himself a fervent and skilled practitioner of torture and atrocious mass murders, talents for which he was elevated to sainthood in 1712. And I'd say this passage is fairly typical of the way in which Pinker relishes attacking Christianity again and again, as he does throughout this book. I could have picked out many other passages of this kind, but I went with this one. He also even tries to tie Christianity to the Nazis. He says, defenders of religion claim that the two genocidal ideologies of the 20th century, fascism and communism, were atheistic. but the first claim is mistaken and the second irrelevant. Fascism happily coexisted with Catholicism in Spain, so he just outright calls Franco a fascist. But many people in the available literature on fascism do question that claim. In Italy, Portugal, so he's calling Salazar a fascist essentially, and Croatia. And though Hitler had little use for Christianity, he was by no means an atheist and professed that he was carrying out a divine plan. Historians have documented that many of the Nazi elite melded Nazism and German Christianity in a syncretic faith, drawing on its millennial visions and its long history of anti-Semitism. Many Christian clerics and their flocks were all too happy to sign up, finding common cause with the Nazis in their opposition to the tolerant, secular, cosmopolitan culture of the Weimar era. And it's kind of funny because Pinker's own data shows that the homicide rate under the mid-century Germans was lower than the homicide rate under the Weimar Republic, and also that Mussolini greatly reduced the homicide rate in Italy during the 1920s and 1930s. So, by his own metrics, those fascist states were more civilized, quote unquote, than the liberal democracies that preceded them. But anyway, let's take a look at his civilizing process in more detail. Pinker's argument for the decline of homicides from 1637 to the mid-1800s in New England amounts to step 1, establish state control, step 2, watch the line go down. That's more or less Pinker's claim. Now, one of Pinker's sources I noted in the book is one of my favourite books, Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher. And according to Fisher, comparatively low rates of violent crime persisted in New England for 300 years and more. Timothy Dwight observed that most people throughout this region never bothered to bar their houses or to keep their valuables under lock and key, even in seaport towns. A lawyer in Beverly, Massachusetts, wrote in 1840 that during a practice of nearly 40 years he had never known a native of Beverly convicted of any heinous crime. Harriet Beecher Stowe believed that New England in her generation was a place where one could go to sleep at all hours of day or night with the door wide open, without bolt or bar, yet without apprehension of any to molest or make afraid. So it seems that Pinker's thesis is being borne out, isn't it? Look how civilized they were in the mid-19th century there after the civilizing process had taken place. It's like magic, isn't it? But how was this achieved? And Fisher goes into exquisite detail here. He says, first, it was achieved by private means. They had a dual idea of the depravity of infants and the perversity of their natural will, which led Puritans to the conclusion that the first and most urgent purpose of child-rearing was what they called the breaking of the will. This was a determined effort to destroy a spirit of autonomy in a small child, a purpose which lay near to the centre of child-rearing in Massachusetts. And that picture there is of a sign that was made for a boy who whispered, and they made him wear this sign all day around his neck to stop him whispering as one of the efforts to break his will. But it was also achieved through public means. Fisher again says, New England was characterized by a curious paradox. This was always the most orderly region in British America, but it was also very violent in its ordering acts. This typically Puritan paradox of private order and public violence was especially striking in the 17th and 18th centuries. For many generations, individual order coexisted with an institutional savagery that appeared in the burning of rebellious servants, the maiming of political dissenters, the hanging of Quakers, the execution of witches, and the crushing to death with heavy stones of an old man who refused to plead before the court. The Massachusetts laws against burglary were exceptionally severe, and court proceedings still more so. Penalties were arranged in a hierarchy of official violence. The most terrible punishment in Massachusetts was burning at the stake. The punishment for cases of petty treason, which were defined as the killing of masters by servants. At least 2 people were burnt alive in Massachusetts. Both were black women, a slave named Maria, who was found guilty in 1681 of setting fire to her master's house in the town of Roxbury, and a slave called Phyllis, who was burned in Cambridge for having poisoned her master with arsenic. The next most terrible punishment was death by hanging. The colony of Massachusetts recognized 13 capital crimes in 1648: witchcraft, idolatry, blasphemy, homicide, rape, adultery, bestiality, sodomy, false witness with intent to take life, and a child of 16 who was a stubborn or rebellious son, or who smote or cursed a parent. All of these laws were drawn from the Pentateuch, except for the punishments for rape. Next to hanging, in point of violence, were punishments by maiming: the slitting of the nostrils, the amputation of ears, the branding of the face or hands. All of these terrible penalties were administered by the Puritans in Massachusetts. Quakers, for example, were punished with special ferocity. Some were branded in the face and burned very keep with a red-hot iron with H for heresy. Others had their ears cut off, faces scarred, and nostrils slit open in a saturnalia of sadistic punishment. For less serious offences, the penalty was whipping, unless one could pay a fine. These punishments were sometimes very severe. 4 Quaker women were ordered to be stripped to the waist, tied to a cart's tail, and conveyed from constable to constable through 12 New England towns, and to be whipped in every town. The women were flogged so terribly that the blood coursed down their naked backs and breasts until the horrified townsmen of Salisbury rose against the constables and rescued them. 1 male Quaker missionary was flogged nearly to death in Massachusetts, and Puritan minister John Norton made a joke of it. He endeavoured to beat the gospel ordinances black and blue, and it was but just to beat him black and blue. So I ask you, is it accurate to suggest, as Pinker does, that Puritan New England was 100 times less violent than England in the 1300s? Well, you can be the judge of that. Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature is little more than statistical trickery and narrative weaving of a kind that I find extremely disappointing from this author. Roth has shown that homicide rates everywhere fluctuate. Here, for example, is Corsica, and you can see how it goes up and down at different times. It is common to see homicide rates fall for a period but then rise again, or vice versa. So on the left here, Roth is showing homicide rates in 19th century England. You can see how they go up and down at different moments. On the right, the top line that you can see with that U shape is the homicide rate in the USA. It fell for a bit in the 1940s and 50s, and then it rose sharply in the 1960s, as we all know. So Roth, who spent his entire life studying this, unlike Pinker, who is a dilettante who comes in just to write this one book on violence to push his liberal progressive agenda, he argues that there are 4 factors that dictate the homicide rate of a given area, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what Pinker calls the civilizing process. It's not some evolving thing where the homicide rate just keeps on going down and down. Obviously, anybody who's been paying attention throughout this video can see that the homicide rate does not just keep on going down and down across the world. He says, as I put it in my own work, there have been 4 principal correlates of low homicide rates in North America and Western Europe over the past 450 years. Number 1, the belief that government is stable and that its legal, judicial institutions are unbiased and will redress wrongs and protect lives and property. 2, a feeling of trust in government and the officials who run it, and a belief in their legitimacy. From this, I'd expect the homicide rate to be rising in America anytime soon. 3, patriotism, empathy, and fellow feeling arising from racial, religious, or political solidarity. Again, I'd expect to see the homicide rate rising all across Europe because those things are in decline. 4, the belief that the social hierarchy is legitimate, that one's position in society is or can be satisfactory, and that one can command the respect of owners without resorting to violence. Now you will have to decide for yourselves whether you think these 4 factors explain things better than Pinker does, but for me, Roth can explain why the homicide rate may go up or down at a given time, whereas Pinker cannot. Pinker has to try to explain away any time the line goes the other way because he expects it to be evolutionary and progressive. And at no time in the book does he, for example, try to explain why the homicide rate in somewhere like South Africa, which is a reasonably rich nation with a democracy, so it ticks all of his boxes, why that is so high compared to other places. He just doesn't go there. In fact, when he does mention South Africa in the book, it's just to make this very woolly statement. He says, in South Africa, the apartheid regime will be dismantled and the white minority will cede power to the black majority. This will happen with no civil war, no bloodbath, no violent recriminations against the former oppressors. Everything's hunky-dory, according to Pinker's worldview there in South Africa. Let's not just mention the fact that their homicide rate of 35 per 100,000 is well above the peak of the 1300s that he was using to bash the Middle Ages over the head with earlier on, or the fact that the homicide rate was clearly much higher in the ANC South Africa than it was in apartheid South Africa back in the 1970s. These figures are pretty difficult to come by, but with enough sleuthing you'll be able to find them. Note that the murder rate goes up even as GDP goes up in South Africa. Pinker makes no attempt to tackle such questions whatsoever, because they don't fit in with the cheery progressive narrative he's trying to push all the way through this book. All of which is to say, the progressive Whig version of history strikes me as being based on some pretty shaky premises that involve statistical trickery, outright lying about aspects of the past, smearing ideological opponents, sidestepping difficult questions. And for all of these reasons, I'd encourage you to treat a man like Steven Pinker with the utmost distrust and to start questioning the Whig version of history in your own mind if you still hold dear to it. The truth is, as we saw from the example of Puritan New England, that social order doesn't just come about by itself. Sometimes you need the whip and the sword in order to make it happen. You will achieve an extremely low crime rate, a very low homicide rate, but the flip side is that you won't be living in a particularly liberal order. It strikes me that Pinker's thesis that the more liberal society gets, the less violent it gets, is clearly contradicted by facts he presents in the book himself. In fact, there are times when Pinker is so delusional in this book that one has to question either his sanity or his honesty. All right, would I recommend checking it out? No, your time is far better spent reading other books. If you must read a book about these sorts of issues. The Randolph Roth one, American Homicide, is a much better treatment. And in the case of British crime, I will never not plug Peter Hitchens' A Brief History of Crime, which will give you a much more honest account of the history of crime in England than Pinker. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. As ever, I read all of your thoughts, and I'll leave it there.
Now available at the Academic Agency. Sharpen your analytical mind and your argumentation skills with Foundations of Logic. The course draws on the ancient wisdom of traditional logic that students learned for over 2,000 years, from the time of Aristotle through to the medieval schoolmen, right down to the 20th century. Sign up now for a free preview lecture.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe, and if you really like my content, maybe consider joining the channel or donating or maybe even buy a mug. I am grateful for all of your support. Now get out.